Some inherit land, some inherit debt, but the rarest inheritance is a place that still remembers how to feed the wounded. Claire Bennett saw Bennett Farm at the end of the gravel road just as the Tennessee morning opened its pale gold eyes over the fields. The sun had not fully cleared the ridge yet, but it had already touched the dry cornstalks with a copper shine and laid long shadows across the leaning fence posts, the empty pasture, and the old white farmhouse that waited beyond them like a tired woman standing in her Sunday dress after everyone else had gone home. The road under her pickup tires cracked and popped with loose stone. Dust rose behind her in a soft brown ribbon, then settled slowly into the ditch where goldenrod and wild asters leaned beneath the weight of autumn dew. Claire kept both hands on the steering wheel longer than she needed to. She was 40 years old, white-skinned, steady-eyed, and quiet in the way veterans often become quiet when they have learned that not every memory deserves a witness. She wore a faded canvas field jacket over a gray work shirt, blue jeans softened by years of use, and boots that had crossed airport terminals, supply yards, back roads, and too many rented rooms to count. Her brown hair was tied back low, practical and plain, with a few early silver strands near her temples that caught the morning whenever she turned her head. In the passenger seat, Mason sat upright, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a silver and tan coat, black shading along his back, amber eyes, and the kind of calm intelligence that made strangers lower their voices around him without knowing why. He had been trained to search, to listen, to recognize changes in scent, pressure, and sound, but Claire had long believed his deeper gift was recognizing the moment before a heart broke open. "Not much to look at anymore, is it?" she said softly. Mason did not look at her. His attention stayed on the farmhouse, then moved beyond it toward the stone well behind the kitchen wing. Claire followed his gaze and felt something inside her tighten. The lawyer in town had been polite but direct. Her father, Thomas Bennett, had left her the farm, 47 acres of tired soil, a farmhouse with peeling paint, a north barn that had not been used in years, a rusted windmill, unpaid repairs, and more questions than money. The property could still sell to a developer from Nashville if she acted quickly. A small equestrian retreat, maybe. A weekend rental place for people who liked old barns better when someone else had done the hard work of saving them. Claire had told herself that selling was practical. She had learned practicality in army logistics and field repair, learned to count fuel, inventory tools, read roads, repair equipment, and keep things moving when weather or distance tried to stop the mission. Practicality had carried her through service. Practicality had carried her home. But it had never taught her what to do with a father who had loved in silence and died before either of them found a better language. The truck rolled past the mailbox, Bennett written in faded black letters, one side hanging lower than the other. She stopped near the porch. The farmhouse stood 2 stories tall, white paint flaking from the clapboards, green shutters faded almost gray, the wide porch sagging slightly at the far corner. A rocking chair with one broken arm sat near the front door. In the yard, a metal water trough had gone dry and filled with curled leaves. Beyond the house, the windmill turned once, slow and uncertain, then stopped though the breeze still moved through the fields. Mason's ears lifted. Claire noticed. She always noticed. That dog had saved her from walking into bad weather, bad roads, bad rooms, and bad decisions more times than she cared to admit. In the world of veteran stories, people liked to talk about courage as if it always wore a uniform and stood tall under a flag. Claire knew courage was often smaller. Sometimes it was getting out of bed before dawn. Sometimes it was answering a phone call from a county lawyer. Sometimes it was driving back to the place where your father had waited for you and finding you were the one who had stayed gone. She opened the driver's door, and the smell of the farm came in at once, dry grass, old wood, clay soil, distant hay, and the faint sweetness of pear trees somewhere behind the house. Mason jumped down before she reached for his leash. He landed lightly on the gravel, stood still, and lifted his nose toward the back of the farmhouse. "Easy," Claire said, but her voice carried no command. She stepped out and shut the truck door. The sound moved across the empty yard and came back smaller. For a moment, she saw the place as it had been when she was a girl, her mother standing in the kitchen window with flour on her hands, her father crossing the yard with fencing pliers in his back pocket, the barn doors open, the pasture green, the air full of the low, ordinary music of things being cared for. Then the image faded, and the farm returned to its present shape, quiet, brittle, waiting. Mason began walking toward the rear of the house. Not running. Not wandering. walking with purpose. Claire followed him past the porch steps, past a stack of old feed buckets, past the kitchen window where a torn curtain hung motionless behind dusty glass. The stone well stood 20 yards beyond the house beneath a ring of weeds and fallen pear leaves. It had been dry for as long as she could remember, capped with weathered boards and wrapped in a rusted chain her father had once told her never to touch. Mason stopped at the edge of it. His body went very still. One paw lifted and rested against the stone. His ears pointed forward. His amber eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in concentration. Claire felt the hair rise along the back of her neck. The windmill creaked behind her, then went silent. Mason lowered his head toward a gap between the stones and breathed in deeply. Then he gave 3 short barks, clear and measured, the same signal he used when he found something that mattered. Claire stared at the well. "There is nothing down there," she whispered, but the words sounded weak the moment they left her mouth. Mason looked back at her, patient and certain. Claire stepped closer, brushing away leaves with the toe of her boot. Between 2 mossy stones, half hidden beneath clay and rust, something metallic caught the first full beam of sunrise. She crouched and cleared the dirt with her fingers until a small tag appeared, tied to an old steel cable descending into the dark below. The tag was no bigger than a dog tag, but the letters scratched into it were unmistakable: C. B. Claire Bennett. Her father had marked it for her. The farm she had come to sell had spoken her name before she even opened the front door. Claire stayed crouched beside the old stone well, her fingertips resting on the small metal tag as the morning light strengthened across Bennett Farm. The initials were not cleanly engraved by a machine. They had been scratched by hand, uneven but careful, the way her father had labeled toolboxes, seed drawers, spare bolts, and everything else he believed might be needed later. C. B. Claire Bennett. 2 letters that made the whole empty yard feel suddenly less empty. Mason stood beside her with one paw still braced against the mossy stone, his silver antan coat bright at the edges where the sun reached him, his amber eyes fixed on the steel cable disappearing through the capped boards. He did not bark again. He simply waited. That was often how Mason worked. He did not demand belief. He gave Claire time to arrive at it. She brushed more clay from the cable and found that it ran beneath the rusted chain, down through a narrow gap in the boards, secured by a newer hook hidden under old leaves. Her father had wanted it concealed from strangers but visible to someone who knew how to look, or someone with a dog who listened to the ground. Claire stood slowly, wiping her hands on her jeans. The farmhouse behind her seemed to watch in silence, its peeling white walls softened by the gold of late morning. She could almost hear Thomas Bennett's boots on the porch, the slow clearing of his throat, the way he would have avoided explaining anything directly by saying, "You will see when you see." She walked back toward the kitchen door with Mason close beside her. The key ring from the lawyer felt awkward in her jacket pocket, heavy with too many keys and too few answers. The back door resisted at first, swollen by damp seasons and neglect. Claire pressed her shoulder gently against it until it opened with a wooden sigh. The kitchen smelled of dust, old pine, dried herbs, and something sweet that time had not fully erased. Sunlight fell through the window over a chipped porcelain sink, a yellowed curtain, and the round oak table where her mother once cooled pies on folded towels. A coffee can sat on the counter beside the stove. A row of blue glass jars lined the shelf above it, each one empty and clean. That detail stopped her more than decay would have. The house had not been abandoned in confusion. It had been left in order by someone who expected another pair of hands to continue the work. Mason moved through the kitchen without touching anything, nose low, paws careful on the faded linoleum. Claire opened the drawer beneath the counter, the one where her father used to keep batteries, twine, pocket knives, and cash folded inside seed packets. Inside was a tin box with a strip of masking tape across the lid. North Barn, the label read, in Thomas's compact handwriting. Claire lifted the box and found 3 keys inside, one brass, one silver, and one small black key with a plastic cover. Beside them lay a folded note. Her breath slowed before she opened it. The paper had been torn from a feed store receipt, and the message was only one line. "Start where the water still remembers." Claire stared at the words while Mason sat near the door, watching the yard. Her father had never spoken like a poet when she was young. He spoke in weather, chores, prices, and repair needs. Yet after her mother died, he sometimes said things that sounded like they came from a deeper well than conversation. Soil remembers rain. Wood remembers hands. A house remembers who stopped singing. Claire had been too young and too angry to hear the tenderness hidden inside those sentences. She folded the note carefully and placed it in her jacket pocket. Outside, the windmill turned once, slow and reluctant, then stilled again. The north barn stood beyond the dry lot, long and low, its red paint darkened by sun and rain, one sliding door fastened with a padlock newer than the boards around it. Claire crossed the yard, boots sinking slightly into the clay. Mason walked ahead, not pulling, but guiding, his body angled toward the barn with a focus that made the air feel charged. On the way, Claire passed the old trough, the rusted fuel tank, the collapsed chicken wire near the fence, and a patch of grass so green it looked misplaced against the dry field. She stopped. The green patch formed a faint line running from the well toward the barn, almost invisible unless the sun caught it from the side. Underground moisture. A repaired line. A secret vein under land everyone had called dead. Claire looked toward Mason. He had stopped at the barn door and was looking back at her. The brass key fit the lock. It turned smoothly, too smoothly for a door supposedly forgotten. When Claire slid the door open, the scent of cedar, hay dust, clean oil, and canvas rolled out into the daylight. The inside did not match the outside. Along the left wall, tools hung in neat rows. Garden hose, shovels, pruning shears, fence pliers, all cleaned and sharpened. On shelves to the right sat labeled plastic bins, blankets, lanterns, seed packets, coffee supplies, first aid, dog bowls, work gloves, winter socks. A stack of folding cots leaned against the far wall under a tarp. Near the center stood a work table covered in brown canvas, with a ledger, a metal thermos, and a pair of reading glasses placed beside a pencil worn short from use. Claire took one step inside and felt the farm change again. This was not a failing property. This was preparation. Quiet, hidden, stubborn preparation. Mason walked straight to the back wall where an old farm map hung between two wooden posts. He lifted his nose and nudged the lower corner. The map shifted, and a folded paper slipped down, floating to the floor like a leaf. Claire picked it up. On the outside, written in her father's hand, were the words, "If Mason finds this first, trust him." Claire looked at the German shepherd. His amber eyes were steady and calm, as if he had carried that instruction long before either of them knew it existed. She opened the paper. Inside was a rough drawing of the well, the barn, and the hidden water line beneath the fields. At the bottom, her father had written one more sentence. "This farm is not dying, Claire. It is waiting for you to decide what kind of life it should feed next." Claire stood inside the north barn with the folded drawing in her hand while sunlight entered through the open sliding door and stretched in long golden bars across the concrete floor. Dust floated in the light like tiny seeds waiting for soil. Mason sat near the old farm map, his silver antan coat glowing at the edges, amber eyes steady on Claire, as if he knew the words on the paper had reached a place deeper than understanding. "This farm is not dying, Claire. It is waiting for you to decide what kind of life it should feed next." She read the sentence again, slower this time, letting each word settle against the hard practical part of her that had arrived planning to sell, sign, and leave before dusk. Around her, the barn answered in quiet details. Blankets folded in sealed bins. Lanterns with fresh batteries. Seed packets sorted by season. Dog bowls stacked beside work gloves. Coffee supplies labeled in her father's careful print. Folding cots wrapped in canvas. First aid kits arranged beside jars of screws and fence staples. It was the kind of order a logistics officer would recognize immediately, not decoration, not sentiment, but readiness. Thomas Bennett had built a supply room for Mercy. Claire moved to the work table and lifted the brown canvas cover. Beneath it lay a thick ledger with a green cloth spine, a set of county forms, and a black binder labeled Bennett Harvest House. The name made her pause. Harvest House. Two words that sounded less like a business and more like a promise spoken over a kitchen table. She opened the binder. The first page held a hand-drawn map of the farmhouse, north barn, stone well, pear orchard, lower field, old chicken yard, gravel drive, windmill, and the dry creek bed beyond the fence. Red pencil lines marked an underground water route from the well to the lower field, then to 3 raised garden plots that did not yet exist. Blue marks showed future pipes. Yellow circles marked solar lights. On the next page, her father had written names. Mr. Ellis, Army, needs light work, cannot stand long. Joanne Miller, 2 grandchildren, winter vegetables. Ray Alvarez, Marine Corps, good with engines, does not like crowds. Helen Brooks, widow, can peaches every August, check porch steps. The list went on, not as charity paperwork, but as a farmer's memory of people. Each name carried a note about dignity. Not poor. Not needy. Not broken. Just people seen closely enough to be helped without being reduced. Claire ran her thumb over the page and felt a strange ache behind her ribs. Veteran stories were often told with big words, sacrifice, courage, honor, homecoming, but here her father had written the quieter vocabulary of survival: warm socks, coffee, steady work, a chair in the shade, soup in January, a ride to the clinic, a garden row that belonged to someone who needed a reason to come outside. Mason rose suddenly and turned toward the far corner of the barn. His ears lifted. Claire looked up. The corner held stacked hay bales, an old saddle rack, and a metal cabinet with chipped gray paint. Mason walked to the cabinet and sniffed along the bottom seam. He gave one soft bark, not urgent, only certain. Claire found the small black key from the tin box and tried it in the cabinet lock. It fit. Inside were not tools, but cassette tapes, envelopes, photographs, and a small portable recorder wrapped in a clean towel. On the top shelf sat a wooden box with her mother's name burned into the lid, Elise. Claire had not said her mother's name aloud in years without feeling it change the weather inside her. She took the box down carefully. The wood still smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. Inside were recipe cards, seed labels, folded church bulletins, and a photograph of Elise Bennett standing in the farm kitchen, smiling over a long table filled with biscuits, jars of pear preserves, fried apples, and coffee mugs. Behind her, written on a chalkboard, were the words "Everyone gets federal." Claire sat down on the edge of a feed crate. The barn seemed to soften around her. She remembered her mother's hands more than her face sometimes, flour on the knuckles, garden dirt under the nails, a wedding ring turned inward while kneading dough. Elise had believed food could find the part of a person that pride kept hidden. She fed neighbors before storms, men working fence lines, church ladies after funerals, children who wandered in after school, and once, a quiet veteran who sat on the back steps for an hour before accepting a plate. Claire had been young then, impatient, eager to leave, embarrassed by how freely her mother gave things away. Now, sitting in the barn among her father's hidden supplies, she saw the truth with painful clarity. Thomas had not invented Bennett Harvest House after Elise died. He had been trying to finish what she had started. A sound came from the yard, soft but distinct, the windmill turning again. Claire looked through the open barn door. The blades moved slowly against the Tennessee sky, catching sunlight with each rotation. Mason stepped outside, then looked back to make sure she followed. He led her not to the well this time, but around the barn to the lower field. There, beyond dry grass and bent weeds, Claire saw 3 rectangular patches outlined by old string and wooden stakes, nearly swallowed by growth but still visible. Future raised beds. She knelt beside one stake and brushed dirt from a small metal marker. Tomatoes, spring. Another red beans for the pantry. Another read Claire's row. Her throat tightened. She did not know whether to laugh or cry, so she did neither. She only sat back on her heels while Mason stood beside her, both of them facing the field her father had believed might live again. The breeze moved through the dry corn, and for the first time since she arrived, Claire did not hear abandonment in the sound. She heard work waiting. She heard breakfast before questions. She heard the long table her mother had imagined and the hidden water her father had saved. She heard a farm asking not to be sold, but to be understood. Claire stayed in the lower field until the sun climbed high enough to warm the back of her jacket. The 3 staked garden plots lay before her like outlines of a future someone had drawn and then trusted her to finish. Mason moved slowly along the rows, nose close to the ground, pausing at each marker as though reading the names beneath the soil. Tomatoes, spring. Beans for the pantry. Claire's row. That last one held her still. Her father had not written daughter's row or family row or something sentimental enough to make the ache easy to dismiss. He had written her name plainly, as he had written it on lunch bags, oil filters, school permission slips, and the inside cover of the field manual she took with her when she first left home. Claire. A name placed in dirt with the quiet confidence that she would one day stand there and find it. She rose slowly and brushed clay from her knees. Across the pasture, Bennett Farm seemed less like a worn-out inheritance and more like a map waiting for a reader. The windmill turned with a soft creak against the blue Tennessee sky. The white farmhouse watched from its rise, peeling but upright. The north barn stood open, its shadow full of supplies that had been kept clean for people who did not yet know they had been expected. Claire turned toward the stone well. The metal tag with her initials still hung from the cable, catching light each time the breeze shifted. She took the drawing from her jacket pocket and followed the red and blue pencil lines with her thumb. The path began at the well, ran beneath the yard, past the barn, crossed toward the lower field, and ended at the old winter kitchen near the pear orchard. She had forgotten that kitchen existed. After her mother died, Thomas had closed it, nailed the door shut, and let the vines take the walls. Or so Claire had believed. Mason had other ideas. He lifted his head suddenly, ears forward, then trotted toward the pear trees beyond the farmhouse. Claire followed, passing the rusted chicken yard and the old clothesline posts where her mother once hung sheets that snapped in the wind like white sails. The pear orchard stood behind the house in 3 uneven rows. The trees were older now, their trunks twisted, branches thin but still holding a few hard green pears. Fallen leaves covered the ground in yellow and brown. At the far edge of the orchard, nearly hidden under honeysuckle and wild grapevine, stood the small outbuilding her mother had called the winter kitchen. Its tin roof was dark with weather, but the window glass had been cleaned. Claire stopped when she saw that. Clean glass on a building the world thought forgotten. Mason approached the door and sat. He did not bark. He only looked at Claire, patient as sunrise. She found another key on the ring from the tin box, the silver one this time. The lock turned with a gentle click. The door opened inward, and the smell that greeted her nearly brought her to her knees: cedar shelves, dried apples, old flour, lemon oil, and the faint sweetness of pear preserves. Light entered through 2 small windows and fell across a long wooden table scrubbed pale from use. Along one wall were rows of empty glass jars, each one washed and turned upside down on clean cloth. A propane stove sat in the corner, newer than anything else in the room. Beside it were large pots, mixing bowls, enamel plates, coffee tins, folded aprons, and a chalkboard mounted above a narrow counter. On the chalkboard, written in white paint rather than chalk, were the words Bennett Table. Beneath them, in smaller script, "Everyone gets federal." Claire stood in the doorway while the room arranged itself inside her memory. Her mother, Elise, laughing with flour on her cheek. Thomas bringing in a basket of pears without saying he had climbed the ladder before breakfast. Neighbors crowding the porch after church. A plate handed to someone who claimed not to be hungry, then accepted every bite. Mason stepped inside and walked straight to the long table. On it sat a manila envelope with Claire's name written across the front. This handwriting was not Thomas's. It was softer, rounder, familiar in a way that made the air leave Claire's lungs. Elise Bennett. Claire reached for the envelope and opened it with care. Inside was a recipe card for pear skillet cake, a photograph of Claire at 12 years old holding a basket of apples, and a letter that had been folded so long the creases had grown soft. "My Claire," it began. "If this kitchen ever finds you again, it means your father finally became brave enough to keep my promise." Claire sat at the table because her legs no longer trusted standing. Mason came to her side and rested his chin on her knee. The letter was short, written years before Elise passed, when illness had already made her handwriting tremble but not dimmed its warmth. She wrote that food was never only food. It was a way to tell a tired person that the world had not stopped making room for them. She wrote that soldiers, widows, children, farmers, and strangers all carried different hungers, and not all of them lived in the stomach. She wrote that Claire had always been strong, but strength would only stay kind if it had somewhere to pour itself. At the bottom of the page, Elise had added one final line. "If you ever wonder what to do with this farm, start by feeding one person and let grace teach you the rest." Claire covered her mouth with one hand, not to hide grief, but to hold it gently. Outside, the pear leaves moved in the wind. Inside, the winter kitchen glowed in warm afternoon light, every jar, apron, and wooden chair waiting as if no year had been wasted. Mason lifted his head and looked toward the open door. Far across the yard, on the gravel road beyond the mailbox, a truck slowed but did not stop. Claire watched it through the clean window. For the first time, she wondered not who had come to buy the farm, but who might come needing a meal. The truck on the gravel road moved slowly past the mailbox, its tires whispering over dust and stone, then continued toward the county road without turning in. Claire watched until the sound faded behind the ridge. For a moment, she felt foolish for hoping, or fearing, that someone had already come to ask something of her. The winter kitchen stood around her in its warm afternoon stillness, smelling of cedar, pear leaves, clean jars, and the old sweetness of a room built to remember hunger without shame. Mason remained beside her chair, his chin still resting on her knee, his amber eyes following the road through the clean window as if he understood that the farm had begun calling before Claire had agreed to speak for it. She folded her mother's letter along its softened creases and placed it back inside the envelope, but the final line stayed open inside her: start by feeding one person and let grace teach you the rest. She had spent years measuring her usefulness by checklists, delivery schedules, repair logs, fuel counts, and whether a convoy of supplies arrived where it was needed on time. Army logistics had taught her that care without structure failed when weather changed, roads washed out, or people grew tired. Her mother's sentence did not argue with that. It simply reached beneath it. Feeding one person was not small if that person had forgotten they were worth feeding. Claire stood and walked to the chalkboard. Bennett table. Everyone gets federal. She touched the painted words with the back of two fingers, lightly, as if checking whether they were dry. Mason rose and turned toward the door. Outside, the sun had shifted west, turning the pear orchard golden along the edges. The old farmhouse cast a long shadow over the yard. Claire carried the manila envelope and recipe card back through the orchard, across the yard, and into the kitchen of the main house. The room looked different from when she had first entered it. The chipped porcelain sink was still stained. The curtain still hung tired and yellowed. Dust still softened the corners. But now the round oak table seemed less abandoned than available. Claire opened the windows above the sink. They resisted, then lifted with a scrape and a rush of late-day air. The smell of dry grass and distant hay entered the room. Mason sniffed once, approved, and settled near the back door. Claire found a broom in the pantry and began to sweep. Not because the whole farm could be saved in an afternoon, and not because she had decided anything official. She swept because the next right thing had a handle and bristles and a floor in front of it. Dust gathered in soft gray lines. Leaves skittered from beneath the stove. A small button rolled out from under the cabinet, mother of pearl, likely lost from one of Elise Bennett's aprons years ago. Claire placed it on the windowsill. She washed the table twice, then a third time. She found coffee in one of the sealed bins in the north barn, still good, vacuum-packed, labeled by Thomas with a date from the previous winter. Beneath the coffee were filters, sugar, powdered creamer, and a note in his handwriting: first pot is for the worker, second is for the guest. Claire stood in the barn holding that note while the light came through the open door and made the dust shine around her boots. Her father had planned even the coffee. The thought nearly broke her, then steadied her in the same breath. By early evening, the kitchen had changed enough for the house to notice. The table was clean. 2 mugs sat near the stove. A lamp glowed in the corner. The recipe card for pear skillet cake lay beside a mixing bowl, though Claire had not baked anything more complicated than canned biscuits in years. She found flour in the winter kitchen, sugar in a seal jar, and 3 hard pears still clinging to a low branch in the orchard. Mason followed her out and watched as she picked them, his ears lifting whenever leaves shifted overhead. "Do not judge me if this comes out wrong," Claire said. The German shepherd blinked slowly, which she took as mercy. She peeled the pears with a pocket knife at the kitchen table, the motion awkward at first, then familiar in a way that did not belong to memory alone. Her mother's handwriting guided her: butter in the skillet, brown sugar, pears first, batter over top, low in patient heat. The old stove took some coaxing, but it worked. As the cake warmed, the smell filled the house slowly: pear, butter, cinnamon, and something deeper than sweetness. It moved through the rooms like a light turning on where no lamp had been placed. Claire leaned against the counter and closed her eyes. For the first time since the funeral, grief did not feel like an empty chair. It felt like someone had left instructions for how to set the table. Mason lifted his head before the knock came. 3 soft taps sounded at the back door. Claire opened her eyes. Through the glass, she saw an older man standing on the porch steps, cap in hand, shoulders narrow beneath a faded green work jacket. His truck was parked by the gate, engine off. He looked embarrassed to be there, as if asking for directions had cost him more pride than he expected. Claire opened the door. The smell of warm pear cake drifted past her into the cooling evening. The man glanced at Mason first, then at the table behind her. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I am Ray Alvarez. I used to help your father with engines now and then. Heard you were back." Claire remembered the name from the binder. Marine Corps. Good with engines. Does not like crowds. Ray held up a small paper bag. Brought coffee. Figured a farm waking up might need some. Claire looked at Mason. The dog stepped aside from the doorway and sat, calm as a host who had been expecting company. Claire felt her mother's letter in her jacket pocket and her father's note near the coffee tin. She opened the door wider. "I have cake almost ready," she said. "You might as well come in." Ray hesitated only a second before crossing the threshold. Outside, the last sun touched the windmill and turned it bright against the Tennessee sky. Inside, the kitchen smelled of pears, coffee, and the first person fed. Ray Alvarez stepped into the Bennett kitchen as if he had entered a church after the service had ended, careful with his boots, careful with his hands, careful not to take up more room than he believed he deserved. The faded green work jacket hung loosely from his shoulders, and his cap stayed folded between his fingers until Claire pointed to the chair nearest the window. "That one gets the evening light," she said, surprising herself with how naturally the words came. Ray looked at the chair, then at the glowing skillet on the stove, then at Mason, who sat beside the back door with the calm dignity of an old doorman. "Your mother used to put people there," he said quietly. "Said a man talked easier if he could watch the fields instead of the walls." Claire felt the sentence move through the room like another kind of inheritance. She took 2 mugs from the shelf and poured coffee, black for Ray because the binder had said he liked it that way, with a little sugar for herself because she suddenly needed something ordinary to do with her hands. The pear skillet cake came out uneven, browned more on one side than the other, but the smell filled the kitchen with such forgiving warmth that neither of them mentioned the shape. Claire cut 2 slices and placed one in front of Ray. He looked at it for a moment before lifting his fork. "Elise made this when my wife passed," he said. "I told her I was not hungry. She told me that was fine, I could sit with the plate until it convinced me otherwise." A small smile touched his face. It did. Claire sat across from him, Mason lying between them beneath the table, one silver rattan shoulder pressed against her boot. Outside, dusk gathered over the farm in violet layers. The windmill turned slowly, its shadow moving across the dry yard. Ray ate in silence for several minutes, and Claire did not rush him. She had learned in service that people often told the truth after the first practical need was met. Water first. Food first. A safe chair first. Only then did the heart decide whether words were possible. "Your father kept my truck running after I stopped being able to keep much else running," Ray said at last. His voice was rough but steady. "Would not take cash. Always said I could pay him when the lower field produced tomatoes again." Claire looked toward the dark window. "He was planning something bigger than I knew." Ray nodded. "Bigger than most of us knew. But some of us guessed." He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a folded paper, worn soft along the creases. "He gave me this last winter. Told me if you came back and opened the kitchen, I should hand it over." Claire stared at the paper. Her father had left instructions in every corner of the farm, not like traps, but like lanterns placed along a road he hoped she might one day walk. She unfolded it carefully. It was a list titled First Supper. Underneath, Thomas had written, "Coffee, pear cake if possible, soup if weather turns, do not ask anyone why they came, let Mason decide who needs the floor by the stove." Claire read the last line twice and glanced down at the dog. Mason's amber eyes were half closed, but his ears shifted as if he knew his name had been written into the farm's mercy long before this night. Ray gave a quiet chuckle. "Your daddy trusted dogs more than committees." "So do I," Claire said. It was the first thing that had felt easy all day. After they finished eating, Ray offered to look at the old pump switch in the north barn. Claire almost told him it could wait, but he was already standing, carrying his mug to the sink as if paying for the meal with motion. They crossed the yard under the first stars, Mason leading, Claire carrying a lantern from the barn supplies. The light made a small golden circle around their feet. Inside the north barn, Ray went straight to the work table, as if memory knew the path. He opened the panel near the back wall and studied the wiring her father had drawn in the binder. He got close, Ray said. Real close. Needed one more relay and maybe someone stubborn enough to flip the switch. Claire held the lantern while he worked. His hands moved slowly but surely, guided by years of engines, radios, tractors, and patient repairs. She watched the small adjustments, the tightening of a screw, the repositioning of a wire, the pause before closing the panel. It reminded her of field repair nights when a whole convoy depended on one person staying calm with a flashlight and a tool roll. Veteran stories did not always unfold beneath flags or speeches. Sometimes they unfolded in barns, beside old pumps, with coffee cooling in the kitchen and a dog listening at the door. Ray stepped back. "Try it." Claire found the switch on the wall. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, feeling the weight of the farm, her parents, the hidden water line, the names in the binder, the sale papers still unsigned in her truck. Then she flipped it. At first, nothing happened. Then deep beneath the floor, a low hum began. Soft. Steady. Alive. Mason stood, ears high. Ray turned toward the open barn door. Outside, somewhere near the lower field, water began moving through an old pipe with a sound like breath returning to a sleeping body. Claire walked out into the night. The first sprinkler head sputtered, coughed, then lifted a silver fan of water into the air. Moonlight caught every drop. The dry field shimmered. Ray removed his cap and held it against his chest, not dramatically, only respectfully, like a man witnessing a promise kept. Claire stood beside Mason, the coolness touching her face, and for the first time since she had arrived, she understood the farm's secret was not hidden because it was shameful. It was hidden because some gifts need the right hands, the right hour, and the right loyal dog to bring them into the light. The water kept moving long after the first silver arc rose over the lower field. It traveled through buried lines Thomas Bennett had repaired in silence, beneath clay that neighbors had called spent, beneath grass that had browned under too many dry seasons, beneath the footprints of a daughter who had come home prepared to let the land go. Claire stood in the moonlit mist with Mason at her side and Ray Alvarez a few steps behind her, all three of them watching the field shimmer as if the farm had been waiting years for someone to remember its pulse. The sprinkler turned slowly, clicking at the end of each sweep, laying beads of water across the staked garden plots where the small metal markers caught the moonlight. Tomatoes, spring. Beans for the pantry. Claire's row. Each label gleamed for a second and disappeared into shadow, then returned again under the moving spray. Mason lifted his muzzle and let the cool droplets settle along his silver and tan coat. His amber eyes softened, and Claire thought, not for the first time, that the German shepherd knew how to stand inside a miracle without trying to own it. Ray put his cap back on and cleared his throat. "Your father used to say the ground was not dead," he said. "Just waiting on honest water." Claire watched the sprinkler complete another turn. "He said a lot of things after I stopped listening." Ray did not answer quickly. That was one of the things Claire already respected about him. Some people rushed to comfort because silence made them uncomfortable. Ray let silence do its own work. "After a while," he said, "a lot of fathers speak too late. A lot of daughters hear too late. That does not mean the words are wasted." The sentence settled over the field with the mist. Claire looked toward the farmhouse, where the kitchen window glowed with lamplight and the pear cake still waited on the table. For years, she had thought healing would feel like a door bursting open, like some clean, final moment when the past stopped hurting. But here, under the Tennessee night, healing felt more like irrigation, slow, underground, finding old roots 1 inch at a time. They shut off the pump near 10 o'clock, not because Claire wanted to, but because Ray warned her that even resurrected plumbing deserved patience. Back in the kitchen, Ray washed his mug despite her protest and placed it upside down beside the sink exactly as if he intended to return. Before leaving, he paused by the back door and looked at the chalkboard note Claire had carried in from the winter kitchen. Bennett table. Everyone gets federal. There is a woman named Helen Brooks, he said. Your father kept meaning to fix her porch steps. She cans peaches every August and pretends she does not need anybody. Claire remembered the name from the binder. I saw her card. She will not ask, Ray said. Most people who need kindness have practiced not asking. Claire nodded. Veteran stories had taught her that long before she found the binder. Men and women could carry whole winters inside them and still say they were fine because fine was easier than explaining the weather. Mason, lying near the stove, lifted his head at Ray's voice. Ray smiled down at him. You keep her honest, all right? Mason blinked once, calm and solemn. After Ray's truck lights disappeared down the gravel road, Claire locked the barn, checked the pump switch, and walked the yard with Mason under a sky crowded with stars. The farm smelled different after water touched the field. Not transformed, not yet, but awake. Damp clay, wet grass, pear leaves, old wood, coffee through the kitchen screen. At the well, Claire stopped. The steel cable still disappeared into the dark below, the tag with her initials resting against the stone. C.B. Not a claim. A calling. She ran her thumb over the letters, then looked at Mason. He really thought I would come back, she said. Mason leaned his shoulder against her leg. The answer did not need a sound. Inside the house, Claire took the sale papers from her truck and laid them on the kitchen table beside the binder, the recipe card, her mother's letter, and Thomas's notes. The developer's offer looked clean, efficient, almost merciful in its simplicity. One signature and the burden would become someone else's vision. She sat with the pen in her hand while the lamp hummed softly beside her. Mason rested under the table, his head on her boot. The farm creaked around them, not pleading, not accusing, only existing with all its unfinished work. Claire turned to the page in the binder marked first week. Thomas had written a list in pencil. Open windows. Test water. Feed one person. Call Helen about porch steps. Ask Ray about pump relay. Plant something before the first frost, even if it is only faith. Claire closed the binder and set the pen down. Outside, the windmill turned once in the dark. She did not tear the sale papers. She did not make a dramatic vow. She only moved them from the center of the table to the far counter, beneath an empty coffee can, where they could wait while better things were decided first. Before dawn, Claire woke to Mason standing at the bedroom door, ears lifted, tail low, listening. For a moment, old habits pulled her upright, alert to some unnamed urgency. Then she heard it too, a vehicle slowing near the mailbox, then stopping. Through the upstairs window, she saw a small car parked by the gate and an elderly woman sitting inside with both hands on the steering wheel. In the gray light, the woman seemed unsure whether to come closer or turn around. Claire dressed quickly, pulled on her boots, and went downstairs. Mason was already at the door. The kitchen still smelled faintly of pear and coffee. Claire opened the back door, then the front, letting the first cool air of morning move through the farmhouse. The woman at the gate looked up. Claire recognized her from the binder before she reached the porch steps. Helen Brooks. Bad porch steps. Canned peaches. Does not ask. Mason walked down the path first, gentle and certain, while Claire followed behind him into the blue Tennessee morning. The day had not fully begun, but the farm was already being given its next chance to feed someone. Helen Brooks did not step out of her car right away. She sat behind the wheel of a pale blue sedan with one hand on the door handle and the other resting in her lap, looking at Bennett Farm as if the place might disappear if she trusted it too quickly. Morning lay soft over the fields, not bright yet, only silver blue at the edges, with mist gathered low around the fence posts and the pear orchard standing quiet behind the farmhouse. Claire walked down the path with Mason ahead of her, the German shepherd moving slowly, gently, without the urgency he used for hidden things. This was different. This was not discovery. This was invitation. When Mason reached the gate, he stopped several feet from the car and sat, his silver antan coat dampened by the morning air, amber eyes calm and steady. Helen looked at him through the windshield. She was small and elderly, wrapped in a faded lavender cardigan over a flowered house dress, her white hair pinned carefully though a few soft strands had escaped near her temples. Her face carried the delicate lines of someone who had smiled often and worried quietly. Claire recognized her from Thomas's notes before a word was spoken. Canned peaches every August. Bad porch steps. Does not ask. Claire opened the gate and stood beside Mason, leaving enough space for Helen to decide the next step herself. "Good morning," Claire said. Helen lowered the window halfway. "I am sorry to come so early." Her voice was thin but composed, the voice of a woman trying to make needs sound like an errand. "Ray Alvarez said there might be coffee." Claire looked back at the farmhouse, where the kitchen lamp still glowed faintly against the dawn. "There is coffee," she said. "And pear cake, if Mason did not eat it in the night." Helen's mouth trembled into a small smile. Mason stood and wagged his tail once, slow and polite. That was enough. Helen opened the car door. Claire noticed the careful way she turned her body, the slight hesitation before placing one foot on the gravel, the pain hidden inside ordinary movement. She offered an arm without making a show of it. Helen accepted as if they had agreed long ago not to mention pride. Together they walked toward the house. The farm seemed to listen to each step. The windmill turned lazily above the barn. The lower field still held a damp shimmer from the night's watering. Near the porch, Helen paused and looked across the yard toward the pear orchard. "Your mother gave me my first peach jars," she said. "Told me if I was going to pretend I did not need help, I might as well preserve fruit while doing it." Claire laughed softly, surprised by the ease of it. That sounds like her. She was kind in a way that made resistance feel silly. Helen touched the porch rail, then looked at the farmhouse with a tenderness Claire was not prepared for. "Your father tried to be the same, but he hid it under repairs." Inside, the kitchen welcomed them with the smell of coffee, cinnamon, and old wood warmed by the first light. Claire pulled out the chair near the window, the one Ray had used, but Helen pointed instead toward the round oak table's far side. "May I sit there? I used to help Elise peel pears in that chair." Claire nodded and moved it for her. Mason settled by the stove, head resting on his paws, eyes open. Claire poured coffee into a blue mug and set a slice of pear cake on a small plate. Helen took one bite and closed her eyes, not dramatically, but with the quiet surrender of someone tasting a room she thought time had taken away. "Not exactly Elise's," Claire said. "No," Helen answered, opening her eyes. "But close enough to make the heart behave strangely." They sat in the gentle clink of mugs and spoons. The kitchen window brightened by degrees. Claire did not ask why Helen had come. The answer arrived when it was ready. "Ray told me the water is running again," Helen said. "And that Thomas had a book with names in it." Claire's hand stilled on her mug. Helen looked down. "I imagine mine is there." "It is." "Stubborn old man." But her voice was full of affection, not complaint. She reached into her purse and removed a small envelope, worn soft at the corners. "He left this with me 2 summers ago. Said if you ever open the farm before selling it, I should return it." Claire accepted it carefully. On the front, in Thomas Bennett's handwriting, were the words, "For the table, when it has its first morning." Claire felt Mason lift his head before she did. The dog watched the envelope with the same stillness he had given the well, the barn map, the hidden water line. Claire opened it. Inside was a check, modest but real, made out to Bennett Harvest House, and a folded page covered in signatures. Not legal signatures. Names from the town. Ray Alvarez. Helen Brooks. Joanne Miller. Samuel Ellis. Nora Pike. Dozens more. At the top of the page, Thomas had written, "We cannot save every field, but we can help this one feed who it can." Helen wiped at one eye with the corner of her sleeve. He came around asking who would give time, jars, seeds, repairs, coffee, whatever they could spare. He said you might not want the farm, and nobody was to pressure you. But he also said if you stayed one morning, even one, we should be ready. Claire looked around the kitchen. The clean table. The glowing lamp. The recipe card. The sale papers still under the coffee can on the far counter. Through the window, the lower field shone in the early sun as if the water had stitched silver thread across the dirt. For so long, she had believed she was returning to a burden. But a burden did not usually come with coffee labeled by her father, recipes saved by her mother, a dog who found every hidden door, and a town waiting quietly with seeds in its hands. Mason rose and walked to the back door, ears lifting toward the orchard. Helen turned to look. He hears something? Claire stood, but Mason did not seem worried. He gave one soft bark, then looked from Claire to Helen to the yard beyond. Outside, on the gravel road, another car slowed near the mailbox. Behind it, a pickup truck followed. Then a third vehicle came around the bend, moving carefully through the morning dust. No one honked. No one rushed. They simply arrived one by one, as if the lamp in the farmhouse window and the first pot of coffee had become a message the whole countryside understood. Claire stood in the kitchen doorway with the envelope in her hand, Helen seated at the table, Mason beside her, and the warm smell of pear cake filling the room. She did not have a speech. She did not have a plan polished enough to explain. But when the first neighbor stepped out carrying a sack of seed potatoes, Claire opened the door wider. The farm had asked her what kind of life it should feed next. At last, she began to understand the answer. By mid-morning, Bennett Farm no longer sounded empty. It did not sound crowded either. It sounded like a place remembering the old music of use, tires rolling over gravel, a screen door opening and closing, coffee poured into mugs, paper seed sacks set on the porch, Mason's paws crossing from kitchen to yard and back again, the windmill turning above it all with a slow, patient rhythm. Claire moved through the farmhouse as if she were learning a new version of her own name. Ray Alvarez stood by the north barn showing two younger men how to check the pump relay without forcing the panel. Helen Brooks sat at the round oak table with a basket of dish towels, telling a woman from the church which jars were best for peaches. Someone had brought eggs. Someone had brought a sack of flour. Someone else carried in 3 folding chairs and apologized because one had a wobble. Claire accepted each offering with a quiet thank you and wrote each name in Thomas's ledger, not for credit, not for display, but because her father had taught her in his hidden way that kindness should be remembered accurately. Mason stayed close but never underfoot, his silver antan coat catching the morning light whenever he crossed the doorway, his amber eyes watching every arrival with calm judgment. If he stepped toward someone, Claire opened the door wider. If he sat back and waited, she waited too. It amused Ray, who said the farm now had a 4-legged intake officer. Claire almost smiled at that, because it was true. Near noon, Nora Pike from the county office arrived with a folder of forms and a careful expression. Claire's stomach tightened when she saw the official seal, but Nora raised one hand before Claire could speak. "Not bad news," she said. "Your father started the paperwork. He did not finish it, but he started it the right way." She spread the pages on the kitchen table between the coffee mugs and the pear cake crumbs. Bennett Harvest House. Agricultural Community Support Use. Volunteer Meal Program. Temporary Daytime Rest Space. Water System Notes. Safety Inspection Checklist. Claire looked at the forms, then at the sale papers still pinned beneath the empty coffee can on the far counter. For the first time, they looked like documents from another life. Nora followed her gaze but said nothing. The courtesy of that silence felt like grace. "You do not have to decide everything today," Nora said. Claire looked out the kitchen window toward the lower field, where people had begun clearing the staked rows. Mason stood at the edge of the field beside Helen, who was pointing with her cane toward a patch of soil that needed turning. Ray laughed at something one of the younger men said. The sprinkler line glimmered in the sun. A row marked Claire's row waited at the center, damp and dark, ready for seed. I think maybe I already decided the important part, Claire said. She crossed to the counter, lifted the coffee can, took the sale papers in both hands, and folded them once. She did not tear them. She did not throw them away in anger. She placed them in the bottom drawer beneath old appliance manuals, where things went when they no longer deserved the table. Then she returned to Nora and picked up the Bennett Harvest House forms. Tell me where to sign first. That afternoon, they planted before the first frost could steal the chance. Not much. A few rows of greens. Garlic. Winter onions. Seed potatoes saved for later. Helen insisted on setting one small marker herself, though everyone pretended not to notice how carefully Claire steadied her elbow. Ray fixed the loose porch board. Nora labeled a folder. A boy from the neighboring farm carried water to the pear trees. In the winter kitchen, two women washed jars while coffee warmed on the stove and the chalkboard words watched over them, Bennett table. Everyone gets federal. As the sun lowered, Claire stepped away from the noise and walked to the stone well. The metal tag with her initials rested against the moss as it had that first morning, but it no longer felt like a question. Mason came beside her and sat. For a while, they simply watched the farmhouse glowing cream in the evening, the north barn open and golden inside, the lower field striped with new work, the winter kitchen windows shining through pear branches. Claire thought of Thomas Bennett alone in the barn, labeling bins, drawing water lines, writing names in the ledger because love had failed him in conversation but survived in preparation. She thought of Elise Bennett leaving recipe cards and a sentence strong enough to outlive grief. She thought of all the years she had believed service ended when the uniform came off, when perhaps service only changed clothes and waited for her in a field. A truck slowed at the gate near sundown. This time, Claire recognized the hesitation immediately. An older woman and a middle-aged man sat inside, both looking toward the house, both unsure whether to enter a place that seemed too kind to be real. Mason stood before Claire moved. He trotted down the drive, not barking, not rushing, carrying welcome and the quiet authority of his body. Claire followed. At the gate, the man rolled down the window. "We heard there might be supper," he said, embarrassed by the need in his own voice. Claire looked back at the farmhouse, where lamplight had begun to fill the kitchen and someone was setting plates on the long table her mother had imagined. The smell of soup drifted from the winter kitchen, warm with onions, herbs, and the first mercy of evening. Claire opened the gate. "There is supper," she said. "And coffee. And no one is going to ask you to explain before you eat." The man nodded once, unable to answer. The woman beside him pressed a hand to her mouth and looked out at the fields. Mason walked ahead of their truck as if leading them home. Night settled slowly over Bennett Farm, but the lights did not go out. The kitchen lamp glowed. The barn lanterns burned softly. The winter kitchen shone beneath the pear trees. Around the table sat neighbors, old soldiers, widows, workers, and people who had not expected to be remembered by name. Claire stood for a moment in the doorway with Mason at her side, watching steam rise from bowls and hands pass bread without ceremony. She did not feel healed in the simple way stories sometimes promise. She felt opened. She felt useful. She felt her parents close not as ghosts, but as work continuing through her hands. Later, after the last dish was washed and the guests had gone or settled into quiet chairs near the stove, Claire stepped onto the porch. Mason lay beside the door, eyes half closed, the guardian of every secret worth keeping. The wind moved through the Tennessee fields, carrying the scent of damp soil, coffee, pear wood, and something newly planted. Claire looked at the sign Ray had helped hang beside the porch steps, Bennett Harvest House. Beneath it, in smaller letters painted by Helen's careful hand, were the words "Everyone gets federal." Claire rested one hand on Mason's head and looked toward the dark rows waiting for morning. The greatest secret her dog had uncovered was never hidden in the well, the barn, or the winter kitchen. It was hidden in the truth that land can feed more than bodies, grief can become shelter, and a veteran who thought she had come home too late can still arrive exactly when mercy needs her.